The problem, you see, was never the land. I want you to understand that from the very beginning, dear friends, because when I tell you this story, and I intend to tell it properly, which means from the part that matters rather than the part that is merely convenient, you will be tempted to conclude that what brought Lord Dorian Alcott, the Earl of Somersby, to his particular difficulty was the estate. The tenants behind on their rents, the north pasture gone to rot, the drainage situation in the lower fields that 3 separate men had described to him in 3 separate seasons as concerning, without any of them doing a single thing about it. But none of that was the problem. The problem was the interviews. He had conducted 5 of them over the course of 2.5 years, in the study at Somersby Hall, with the methodical attention he applied to most things, which is to say, a great deal of method and rather less patience than method alone requires. He had engaged 5 land stewards in that time. He had parted ways with all 5 of them. The reasons varied in their particulars, and were essentially identical at their root. Each man had agreed with him thoroughly and consistently, and the state had declined in proportion to how thoroughly they agreed. You may think you know the sort of man Lord Alcott was. Perhaps you have met him, or someone very much like him, in drawing rooms or boardrooms or family dinners where one person speaks and the rest of the table nods along, not because the person is right, but because disagreeing with him requires more energy than most people are willing to spend. He was tall and precise, with the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of mild impatience. He was 36 years old. He had inherited the earldom at 24 and had been managing it since, which meant he had 12 years of experience and 12 years of habits, and some of those habits were very good indeed, as you will shortly come to understand, were quietly, they catastrophic. His secretary, Mr. Peel, was 61 and had served the Somersby estate for the better part of 4 decades, first under the previous Earl and then under this one. He was a small, precise man who wore the same expression whether he was announcing a visitor, delivering difficult financial news, or watching the 6th prospective land steward be dismissed from the study. This was not because he felt nothing. It was because he had worked for the Alcott family long enough to understand that visible feeling in a secretary is a luxury, and Mr. Peel did not indulge in luxuries. He kept his opinions in their proper place. He waited. He was, in his quiet way, an extraordinarily patient man. He had found the 6th candidate himself. Now I want you to stay with me here, dear friends, because this is the part where you might think I am going to tell you something was unusual about the recommendation, that Mr. Peel did something remarkable, but he did not. He simply sent a note to his lordship that read, "A Miss Beatrice Stowe has inquired about the steward's position. She comes from the Hartley agency. Her references are, I believe, worth reading." That was all. No understatement, no flourish, just the note and the references and the particular weight that Mr. Peel gave to things he considered worth his employer's time. Lord Alcott read the references twice. They were, as advertised, worth reading. Miss Stowe had managed the agricultural accounts for a landed estate in Wiltshire for 4 years, had assisted in a drainage project in Somerset that had turned 200 acres of underperforming lowland into productive pasture, and had. This was the detail that made him set the papers down for a moment, identified and corrected a systematic error in her previous employer's rent collection that had been quietly bleeding the estate for 7 years without anyone noticing. Her previous employer had written in the reference letter, "I would not let her go, except that my son has taken over the accounts and she is rather more capable than he is, which has made things uncomfortable." This, Lord Alcott found himself thinking, was either the most damning thing he had ever read about a previous employer or the most honest. He was uncertain which. He arranged the interview for a Thursday. She arrived on time, neither early nor late, which he noted without assigning particular significance to it. Though 3 of the 5 previous stewards had arrived early, and arriving early to an interview struck him, if he was honest with himself, as a form of presumption. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with the practical bearing of someone who spent considerable time out of doors, and the kind of composed attention that comes from years of looking at numbers and expecting them to mean something. She sat down across from him. He began. He was perhaps 6 minutes into his description of the position when she said, "May I stop you there, my lord?" He stopped. He looked at her. She said, "You are describing a problem of management, the position you want filled. But the problem you have is not a problem of management. It is a problem of information." The study was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the kitchen garden in the way November wind does, persistent and without interest in its effect on anyone indoors. Lord Alcott said, "I beg your pardon." Miss Stowe said, "The 5 stewards, you engaged them to manage the estate better than it was being managed. They failed to do so, but the reason they failed is not that they were poor managers. At least," she paused, with the precision of someone who does not like to overstate things, "not primarily. The reason they failed is that they were working from the wrong map." "The wrong map," he repeated. "You have been telling them what you want the estate to do," she said, with the patient, unhurt quality of someone explaining a thing that seems obvious to her, and has apparently not been obvious to anyone else. "But you have not asked it what it is already doing. The north pasture, the drainage issue in the lower fields, the rent arrears in the eastern parcels. These are not failures of the men you hired. They are symptoms. The estate is telling you something is wrong at the foundation, and you have been responding by changing the people rather than reading the message." He looked at her for a long moment. "The 5 stewards," he said, "did they not read the message?" "I cannot speak to what they read," she said. "I can speak to what I would read, and what I would read, before I did anything else, is the drainage survey from 1842, the original soil assessments for the north pasture, and the rent ledgers going back 12 years. Not to understand what went wrong. To understand what was always true that no one has yet acknowledged." He said, "Go on." She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has said the true thing and is not in the habit of retreating from it once it has been said. "The land you have," she said, "is not the land you think you have. The maps and the ledgers and the surveys you are working from are a picture of what someone hoped the estate would be some time ago. The actual estate is different, and until someone looks at what is actually there, rather than what is recorded as being there, you will keep engaging stewards and dismissing them and wondering why the results are the same." Lord Dorian Alcott, the Earl of Somersby, sat back in his chair. He thought, 5 interviews, 5 men who nodded, 1 woman who in 6 minutes told him the frame was wrong. He thought, "I either end this interview now, or ask her the question that will tell me whether I should." "What," he said, "would you do first?" And she told him. Not in the vague, reassuring language of someone performing competence, but in the specific sequential language of someone who has done it before and knows exactly what it requires. The drainage survey, the soil assessments, a series of conversations with the tenant farmers in the eastern parcels, not to collect the rents, not yet, but to understand what they knew about the land that had never made it into any written record, because tenant farmers in the eastern parcels had been farming that ground for 3 generations, and they understood it in ways that no survey could fully capture. Then the ledgers, then, and only then, a plan. When she had finished, the study was quiet again. "Why," Lord Alcott said slowly, "did you tell me the frame was wrong?" She looked at him steadily. "Because it is wrong, my lord. And I have found, in my experience, that pointing out what is wrong with a thing at the outset is considerably less costly than discovering it 6 months later, when the wrong approach has been thoroughly implemented. Most candidates," he said, "do not do that." "No," she agreed, "most candidates want the position." "You want the position," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I want it with a clear understanding of what the position requires, And what it requires, as you have been defining it, is impossible. You cannot fix the estate without first understanding the estate, and understanding it will produce surprises. Not because the surprises are new, but because no one has looked at the actual thing in quite some time. He was quiet for a moment. You mentioned the rent ledgers going back 12 years. Yes. The error, the one you found in Wiltshire, how long did you say it had been operating? 7 years, she said. And no one had found it. No one had looked for it, she said. There is a difference. Lord Alcott looked at this woman across his desk, in his study, on a Thursday in November, and thought a thing he had not thought after any of the previous 5 interviews. That he had not been asking the right questions, and that the right questions had just been demonstrated to him, and that this was either very fortunate or very late, and possibly both. When he said, "Can you start?" something moved across her face. Not the broad relief of someone who had been desperate, and here I will tell you, dear friends, that she had been. The position in Wiltshire had ended, the London inquiries had not gone well, and the Hartley agency had been forthright with her that a woman seeking a land steward's position was not a simple matter. She had known this before she walked through the door of Summersby Hall. She had walked through it anyway. But what showed on her face was not desperation. It was the brief, contained expression of someone who has taken a considerable risk and found it justified. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and then it was gone. "Monday," she said, "if that is convenient." "Monday is convenient," he said. She stood, he stood. "Miss Stowe," he said. "My lord." He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who found apology natural. He found it rather the opposite of natural. But he had been, in the previous 40 minutes, told a true thing that 6 minutes of conversation had revealed, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. "The 5 stewards," he said. "I dismissed them for failing to turn the estate around. I should have looked earlier at whether I had given them an accurate map to work from." She said, "You should have." He held the look. She did not look away. "Monday," he said. "Monday," she agreed and left. Mr. Peel appeared in the doorway of the study not 30 seconds later. He had the expression of a man who has been doing careful work in the adjacent room and is not going to mention it. Lord Alcott said, "Not a word." Mr. Peel said, "Of course not, my lord." A pause. "She starts Monday then." "She starts Monday." Mr. Peel nodded with the satisfied composure of someone whose assessment of a candidate has been thoroughly borne out, and withdrew. "Now, I want you to stay close here, dear friends, because this is the part of the story that looks simple and is not. Miss Stowe began on Monday. She was, as she had implied she would be, extremely good at her work. But I find that people, when they hear this kind of story, tend to imagine that extremely good at her work means something rather dramatic. Brilliant decisions, instant transformations, the tenant rents paid up, the north pasture blooming, the drainage fixed by Thursday. It was not like that. It was, in fact, much more interesting than that. What she did in the first 2 weeks was simply look. She walked the estate with a worn leather notebook and a measuring tape and an expression of focused, unhurried attention. She spoke to every tenant farmer by name. She had learned the names before Monday, from the ledgers he had allowed her to review over the weekend. And she asked them questions that were not the questions they had been asked before, not about the rents. About the land, what it did in wet years. Where it drained naturally, where it did not drain at all regardless of what anyone did to it. What they had learned from their fathers, and what their fathers had learned from their fathers, and what none of that had ever found its way into any formal survey. She filled 3 notebooks in 2 weeks. And then she came to Lord Alcott with a report. Not the reassuring kind, not the kind that tells an employer what they want to hear, the kind that tells them what is actually there. He read it in his study on a Wednesday afternoon, and, when he had finished, he sat for a considerable time looking at nothing in particular, because the report was, among other things, a very clear account of how much he had not known, and how long he had not known it, and how long he had not known it, and how very different things would have been if someone had looked at the actual ground rather than the recorded version of it. He wrote back to her. The assessment is correct. I would like to discuss the north pasture recommendation before approving it. The drainage proposal for the eastern parcels should begin in spring. Thank you. She wrote back. The north pasture recommendation will hold. But the Southgate access road needs attention before the drainage equipment can reach the eastern parcels. I have included an estimate. Also, the 1842 survey has an error in the boundary description on the 3rd page that may affect the Hargreave tenancy. I have flagged it for the solicitor. He looked at this note for a long moment. He had not known about the boundary error. His father had not known. He was reasonably certain no one had known for at least 80 years. He wrote, "Noted, refer to the solicitor. The access road estimate is approved." And so it went. A note from her, a response from him, a confirmation, an action. It was, he found himself thinking, the most efficient and accurate professional exchange he had conducted in years. He was also finding, with the specific quality of a man who has not been looking at something and has suddenly begun looking at it, that the professional exchange was not the only thing he was noticing. He noticed on the 3rd Thursday that the estate office, a room he had not voluntarily entered in 4 years, on account of it having been, under the management of the 5 previous stewards, a study in accumulating disorder, had been reorganized, not superficially. The surveys were filed by year and by parcel. The lease agreements were arranged in the order in which they fell due for renewal. There was on the corner of the desk a small clay pot holding a single late-season sprig of something he could not name, cut from the kitchen garden, which had apparently still been producing something useful even in November, and which no one had thought to bring inside until now. He noticed on the following Tuesday that the North Pasture Report had a footnote referencing a natural philosophy text on soil composition that he had not read. He found the text in the library, in the southeast corner, which had been reorganized at some point in the past 2 weeks. He was not entirely certain it had been reorganized by anyone other than Miss Stowe, because the previous arrangement had been his own, and it had been alphabetical, and she had apparently found something better. He sat in the library for a good while, looking at the reorganized corner. He thought, she has been here 3 weeks. He thought, she is the most capable person on this estate, including me. He thought, with the particular honesty of a man who is being honest with himself in a room where no one else can hear him. She is not the only thing I am finding capable. He set that thought carefully to one side. He was not a man who acted on things before he had examined them properly. He examined it in the following week, with the thoroughness he had brought to the drainage surveys and the lease agreements and the boundary error in the 1842 survey. He found, having examined it, that it was not going away, and he decided, in the way that precise people decide things directly, without ceremony, to address it. He found her in the estate office on a Tuesday morning working through the updated soil assessments with the focused attention she brought to everything. She heard him in the doorway and looked up. My lord. Miss Stowe, he came in the library. She held his gaze steadily. The reorganization, I should have asked. No, he said. It was right. I would not have thought to do it. She looked back at the assessments. The series in the southeast corner needed to be read in order. The previous arrangement did not allow for it. No, he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, you read. She looked up. Not the surveys, he said, in general. The question was outside the professional register, and they both knew it. She looked at him with the particular quality he had first encountered in the interview, the assessing steadiness of someone deciding what a question actually is before answering it. Yes, she said after a moment. History, mostly. Some natural philosophy. A certain amount of practical land management which I realize does not count as leisure reading to most people. The footnote in the North Pasture report, he said. The soil composition text. It is very good, she said. I first read it in Wiltshire. The third chapter is the most useful. He had read the third chapter. He agreed with her. I have been thinking about the interview, he said. She was still. You told me, he said, that the estate was working from the wrong map, that no one had looked at what was actually there. Yes. You were right. I know, she said, and then, after a pause, it is usually the case that I am right about what I have examined thoroughly. What I am less certain about is things I have not had the opportunity to examine. What have you not had the opportunity to examine? He said. She set her pen down on the assessments. She looked at the window for a moment, the grey November light, the bare garden, the particular stillness of a cold morning that has not yet decided what it intends to do with itself. This situation, she said finally. In my experience, my lord, positions of this kind tend to go one of two directions within the first season. Either the work is trusted or it is not. If it is not trusted, the notes and the reports and the reorganized libraries produce no lasting effect, because they are reviewed but not followed, and eventually the person who produced them understands they are not actually being used and leaves, or is invited to leave. If it is trusted, she paused, things become more complicated. Complicated, he said. More interesting, she amended, with a precision that was not quite a correction and not quite a concession. More difficult to keep at the proper professional distance. And which direction do you find yourself? He said. She looked at him directly. I find myself in the second, which I was not certain about in the first weeks. I am more certain now. He held her gaze. Miss Stowe, he said, I am going to say something that is not within the scope of this visit. You have already said several things outside the scope of this visit, she said. I know. He did not look away. I find that the estate reports are not the primary thing I read on Wednesday afternoons. Not because the reports are not important, because the person who writes them has become. He paused, searching for the right word with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered, more interesting to me than is strictly professional. The estate office was very quiet. I am aware, he said, of how that observation is situated, the position, the authority. I am not saying it to create a burden for you. I am saying it because I have spent 2 weeks not saying it, and the not saying has required more effort than I am accustomed to expending on silence. She looked at the assessments on the desk, at the clay pot in the corner with its sprig of late rosemary, at the reorganized shelves. She had done all of it, the notes, the surveys, the small sprig of something living, without being asked to, because it was the right thing, and because she was someone who did the right thing when she saw it, regardless of whether anyone was watching. It does not create a burden, she said. He waited. It creates a question, she said, what you intend to do about it. He thought about this for longer than most men would have, which she did not misread as uncertainty. She had already understood that he was a man who thought before he spoke, and that this was not a flaw. I intend, he said, to continue exactly as I have continued. To read the reports on Wednesdays and to follow the recommendations and to walk the North Pasture in spring when the drainage work begins, and to stop pretending that the very good footnotes are the reason I read the reports carefully. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. That is a restrained intention. I am working within the appropriate limits, he said. The limits being the position you hold, and the fact that I have dismissed 5 people from this estate and would prefer not to arrive at 6. The 6 situations are not comparable, she said. No, he agreed. They are not, but your comfort in this position is the first thing on my list. Everything else is further down. She looked at the window again, the November garden, the rosemary in the pot that she had put there not because anyone had asked, but because something living in a working room seemed right to her. She had been in too many rooms, she was thinking, where she had managed herself into what was convenient. Kept the question down, said yes when she meant no, and nothing when she meant something, and appropriate when she meant the opposite. She had decided, before she walked through the door of Summersby Hall, that she was not going to do that again. "I will tell you something," she said. He waited. "I came to this estate because the work was right for me, and because the man offering it had not yet understood what the work needed to be. I corrected him in the interview because it needed correcting. I told you that." "Yes. What I did not tell you," she said, "is that the correction was not only practical. It was a decision I had made before I arrived, that I was not going to walk into another room and agree with something that was wrong for the sake of the position. The cost might have been the position. I had already decided I was willing to pay it." "And now," he said. She looked at him. "And now I find that the same principle applies here. I am not going to manage something into silence because the management is convenient." "What?" he said. "Are you not going to manage into silence?" She said, with the same direct, unhurried precision that had stopped him mid-sentence in the interview 6 weeks ago. "The fact that the interest is not entirely coming from one direction." The estate office was very quiet. Outside, the November garden went about its business, cold and bare, and entirely unconcerned with what was happening indoors. He said, "Come and have dinner tonight. Not the steward's dinner, not the working meal." As the person who found the boundary error and reorganized the library and brought the rosemary in from the cold because it seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at him for a long moment. "The household will notice." "Yes." "It will produce questions." "Yes." "You are not concerned." "I am concerned about the right things," he said, "in the right order. You are considerably higher on that list than the household's questions." She looked at the clay pot on the corner of the desk, at the surveys in their proper order on the shelves, at the winter light coming thin through the office window. "At 7, she said. "At 7, he agreed. He left the office, he thought. 7 o'clock, he thought. That is 4.5 hours, he thought. That is the shortest 4.5 hours I have looked forward to in a very long time. He was right about that, dear friends. He was entirely right. Dinner at 7 became dinner on Thursdays. Not by declaration, nothing formal was ever said. It simply became the shape of things, the way arrangements become the shape of things when they are right. Through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of evenings that neither of them had to perform. If you are waiting for the external drama, dear friends, the scandal, the rival, the family objection, I am afraid I must disappoint you. The county was not thrilled, an earl and his land steward. It was talked about over tea and discussed in the particular language of communities that have not expected something and are not entirely sure what to do with it once it arrives. But Lord Alcott was an earl, and she was extraordinarily good at her work, and the estate under her management was already showing results that the most skeptical neighbours could not entirely pretend not to notice, and so the county did what counties do. It adjusted. Slowly, with considerable noise, and then as if nothing had ever been otherwise. What I want to tell you about are the Thursday evenings. She told him things about the estate he had never known. Not from the surveys, but from the farmers' stories she had gathered in her notebook, the history of the land that lived in people and not in documents. He told her things about the earldom that he had never told anyone. The real version, not the performance of it, the complications and the losses, and the things that had gone wrong in ways he had never fully admitted, because there had been no one to admit them to who would understand rather than simply absorb them. She understood them. She connected them to other things. She had thoughts about the Eastern tenancy situation that were considerably better than his solicitor's thoughts. He implemented them. He told her so the following Thursday. She said, "I knew they were right." He said, You might exercise a little grace about it, she said. I save my grace for the things I am uncertain about. He looked at her across the dinner table. Are you ever uncertain? She considered this with the seriousness she brought to real questions. About assessed facts, rarely. I check before I conclude. About people, she paused, more often. People are considerably harder than drainage surveys. What are you uncertain about at present? He said. She looked at him. At present, nothing. He held the look. Good, he said. She smiled. The full version of it which he had been collecting since the interview with the attention of someone who understands a thing is rare. It changed her face entirely, and he thought, in the private way of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not fully anticipate arriving. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time in pursuit of that particular smile, and I do not find that a difficult prospect. Now, dear friends, and here I must ask you to stay with me for just a little longer, because we are nearly at the end, and the end is, I think, my favorite part of this story. On the Thursday of the 14th week, Lord Alcott said, at the end of the evening, I want to speak about the terms of the position. She was very still. Not to change the work, he said quickly. The work is right. The estate is better than it has been in 20 years. I want to discuss whether the terms as they currently exist describe what is actually happening. She looked at him with the assessing quality he had come to know as her most serious mode. The position is working, she said. Yes, the position is working perfectly. I want to add to it. What would you add? He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who struggled for words, and this was a difficulty with words, and he sat with that difficulty honestly rather than rushing past it. The Thursday dinners, he said finally, are not professional. No, she agreed. They are not the dinners of a lord and his steward. No. They are the dinners of. He paused. I do not know the precise word for what we are. I know that employer and employee does not describe it. I know that the position description, as currently filed, does not describe it either. She was quiet, the real quiet, the thinking quiet, not the managed kind. I corrected you in the interview, she said at last, because I had decided not to agree with wrong things for the sake of convenience. I came to dinner on a Thursday because the same principle applied, and 14 Thursdays later. She paused, and he waited, because he had learned to wait for what came after her pauses, because what came after her pauses was always the truest thing. I find that I have not been in a room where I could simply be what I am without management for a very long time. And I would like to continue to be in this room. He said, stay. She said, I am staying, I told you Monday. Not as the steward, he said. As, he stopped and started differently, because the word he wanted was not a professional word, and he was honest enough to say it that way. As the person who corrected me mid-sentence and reorganized the library and brought the rosemary in from the cold. As that person. In this house. With me. She looked at him across the Thursday table. The hall quiet around them, the estate running as it should, for the first time in a very long time. You are asking me to marry you, she said. Eventually, he said. First I am asking you to stay. The rest comes after the staying. The staying and the marrying seem connected. They are connected, he said. I want to be honest about the whole of what I am asking. She looked at the table, the good china. The two settings for two people who had been eating dinner together on Thursdays for 14 weeks, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Because it was. Because some things are simply right, and the rightness does not require arguing. Yes, she said. He breathed. The position description will need to be revised, she said. Mr. Peel can manage it, he said. Mr. Peel has been listening from the adjacent office since October. He will be impossibly pleased with himself. He is already impossibly pleased with himself. It will not materially change. She smiled. He thought, there it is, he thought. I am going to spend the rest of my life in pursuit of that smile, and that is a very good prospect indeed. He was right, it was. The position description was revised. Mr. Peel handled it with the expression of a man who has been quietly correct about something for 4 months, and is now watching the correctness confirmed in writing. He placed the revised document on Lord Alcott's desk on the following Tuesday morning, with the composure of someone who has rehearsed for precisely this moment. Lord Alcott read it. In Mr. Peel's impeccable hand it said, "Position of Countess of Somersby. Responsibilities to include estate assessment and management, tenant affairs, Thursday dinners, and the correction of the Earl when his framing of a problem is incorrect, to be applied as required and not as a policy." Lord Alcott looked up. Mr. Peel looked back with the expression of a man who has spent 4 decades in service and has learned to make a face that says absolutely nothing while conveying everything. "Not a word," Lord Alcott said. "Of course not, my lord." A pause. "Shall I file it?" "File it," Lord Alcott said. "And now, dear friends, you who have sat with me through this story, through the wrong maps and the right questions and the rosemary brought in from the cold and the 14 Thursday dinners and the correction delivered mid-sentence to a man who needed it, I want you to know that Miss Beatrice Stowe became the Countess of Somersby, which surprised the county considerably, and that the estate in the years that followed ran precisely as well as you would expect of a place whose problems were finally being seen clearly. If you found this story worth your Thursday evening, I hope you will stay with us here at Moonlight at Bellwood, dear friends. Leave a word in the comments. I read everyone, and I am always grateful for the company. And if you are new to this fireside, the subscribe button is just there, and there is always room on the settle for one more. The last thing Lord Alcott said, on the evening the revised position description was filed, was this. He went to find his countess in the estate office, where she was reviewing the spring drainage plan with the focused attention she brought to everything, and he sat in the chair across from her. There were 2 chairs in the estate office now, which had not been the arrangement when she arrived. And he said nothing at all for a long time. She did not ask him why he was there. She already knew. He thought 6 interviews. He thought the 6th one, 6 minutes in. He thought the truest thing anyone had said to him in 2.5 years. And she had said it without hesitation, because she had decided, before she walked through the door, that she was not going to do otherwise. He had recognized it. He had asked her to start on Monday. She had stayed. Everything else was simply the out of their lives, which was, by any fair accounting, the most accurately mapped territory either of them had ever had the good fortune to inhabit.